The East Clearing. A horror sleep story, a forest survival horror story. They had come to the mountains for quiet. Chapter 1. The last turn. By the time Ethan turned the car onto the last mountain road, the evening had already begun to close around them. The road narrowed until it seemed less like a road and more like a black ribbon laid between walls of pine. On one side, the mountain climbed into a steep, dark slope crowded with fir and cedar. On the other, the ground fell away into a valley full of fog. The headlights caught pale trunks, broken stones, and once, very briefly, a wooden sign leaning at an angle. Ethan only saw the end of the painted words before it slipped past in the dark. Mira had fallen quiet 10 minutes earlier. She sat with her jacket folded over her knees and watched the woods through the side window, as if she expected the trees to step closer and peer back. During the first hour of the drive, she had talked about everything in the cheerful way she always did when she was nervous. She had talked about the tiny bakery in town. She had talked about whether the cabin would have a fireplace. She had talked about how badly she needed one night away from phones, people, work, traffic, and all the stale noise of ordinary life. Now the words had run out. "It has to be near," Ethan said, leaning forward over the wheel. "The map says another 3 minutes. The map said 10 minutes 15 minutes ago. It's a mountain road." That is not a real answer. He smiled anyway, but the smile did not fully settle on his face. He had booked the house because the photographs looked unreal in the best possible way, an old wooden place high in the mountains, wrapped in fir trees with a porch overlooking a valley. The listing had called it quiet, private, and untouched by the world. At the time, that had sounded perfect. Now, with night gathering in the ravines and the signal bars on both their phones dead, untouched by the world no longer sounded romantic. It sounded like a mistake dressed nicely. Then the headlights found the gate. It appeared all at once. 2 stone posts sunk into the earth and a rusted iron gate hanging open between them. Beyond it, a gravel lane wound through the trees. Ethan slowed, checked the paper directions on the passenger seat, and turned in. The pines crowded close enough to brush the side mirrors. Their branches met overhead in places, shutting out what remained of the sky. Gravel crackled beneath the tires. Somewhere beyond the dark, water moved over stone in a thin, cold rush. Mira straightened in her seat. "Tell me you hear that. The stream." "No, that." He lifted his foot from the accelerator. For a second there was nothing except the engine and the hush of the trees. Then, very far off, something sounded once in the forest. Not a howl. Not exactly. It was a long, rising cry that ended abruptly, as if a throat had been covered by a hand. Ethan waited for it to come again. It did not. "Fox, maybe," he said. Mira looked at him. "You do not believe that?" "No." "Good." The lane turned once, then twice, and the house rose suddenly from the dark. It stood on a shelf of land between the forest and a drop toward the valley. A 2-story timber house with a steep roof, a stone chimney, and black windows that reflected the last ash-gray light of evening. The porch wrapped around the front and one side. Behind it loomed the wall of trees. A shed sat farther back near the slope, half hidden among trunks. The whole place looked older than in the photographs, not ruined but worn in a way that felt private, as if the house had a memory longer than anyone living. The headlights swept across the porch. For one quick second, Ethan thought someone was standing there. He braked so hard the seat belt caught across his chest. Mira grabbed the dashboard. "What?" But there was no one. Only a rocking chair, a narrow table, and a coat rack made from deer antlers mounted beside the front door. The shape he had seen must have been the chair and the antlers and the shadows between them joining into something human for a breath of time. He let out the air he had trapped in his lungs. "Nothing," he said. "Bad angle." Mira turned and looked at him fully now. "If you start saying bad angle and old house and probably the wind, I'm going to lose all respect for you." He laughed, and that helped. A little. They unloaded in silence, carrying bags and food and blankets from the car to the porch. The cold in the mountain air was sharper than they had expected. It bit at their fingers. The valley below the house was a bowl of pale mist, and above the pines the first stars looked thin and brittle. Somewhere nearby an owl called once, low and hollow. The key was where the owner had said it would be, in a metal box hidden behind a loose board beside the door. The front lock stuck at first and then gave with a hard click. When Ethan pushed the door inward, a breath of old wood and stone and cold ash came out to meet them. Inside, the house was larger than it seemed from the yard. A sitting room opened before them with a broad stone fireplace, shelves lined with dusty books, and windows on 3 sides. The furniture was old but well kept. A narrow hall led toward the kitchen. Stairs climbed to the 2nd floor. Lamps stood ready on side tables, and a box of split wood waited beside the hearth. Everything felt arranged for comfort, yet nothing felt recently lived in. "Okay," Mira said softly. "This I love." Her voice fell strangely in the room. The walls did not echo. They seemed to take sound in and keep it. They made tea. Ethan built the fire. The flames lifted in the grate, painting the beams overhead in amber light. For a while the tension of the drive loosened. Mira curled up on the sofa under a blanket. Ethan opened one of the old books and found it was a field guide to mountain birds, printed 40 years earlier. The heater clicked weakly beneath a window, unable to compete with the cold pressing from outside. "Listen," Mira murmured after some time. He looked up. At first he heard only the fire and the tiny sounds an old house makes when it settles into night. Then he caught it, a soft, irregular tapping from outside the room. Tap, a pause, tap, tap. He set the book aside. "Tree branch." "There are no branches against the wall," I checked. The tapping came again, this time from farther along the house. Not at the window, not at the door. Somewhere outside, moving. Ethan rose and crossed to the front window. The glass held his reflection and the room behind him. He cupped his hands around his face and peered into the dark. The porch was empty. Beyond it, the yard sloped away into the black shapes of shrubs and fence posts. Past that, the forest stood like a wall. He saw nothing. When he turned back, Mira had gone still. "What?" he asked. She pointed toward the side window, the one facing the narrow strip of yard between the house and the trees. Ethan followed her gaze. There, on the outer edge of the firelight's reflection, was a shape passing the glass. Not walking, gliding. It crossed too quickly to be understood and was gone before his mind could give it a name. Both of them stood motionless. The silence that followed was worse than the sound. "Did you see?" "Yes," Mira whispered. "What was that?" She drew the blanket tighter around her shoulders. "You tell me." Ethan reached for the lamp on the nearest table and turned it higher. The warm circle of light deepened, but beyond the windows the dark only grew darker, as if annoyed by the attempt. The tapping began again. This time it came from the back of the house, then from above them. Then, after a long enough pause for hope to form, from directly beneath the floor. Chapter 2. The first voice neither of them moved for several seconds. The sound under the floor was not loud. That was what made it so bad. If something had slammed itself against the boards, if some animal had thrown its weight against the foundations, then the fear would have found a shape immediately. It would have become a practical problem. A bear, a loose panel, a trick of the pipes. But this was softer than that. A slow, dragging noise beneath the sitting room, as if fingers were being pulled across the underside of the boards. Mira took one step backward until the sofa touched the backs of her legs. "Tell me there's a basement," she said. "There wasn't one in the listing." "There had better be one." The sound stopped. Then, from somewhere near the kitchen came a single knock, not on the front door, not on the back door, on the wall itself. Ethan grabbed the fireplace poker. It was absurdly light for the size of the room, a thin black iron rod with a hooked end. He wished at once for something heavier. Mira looked around, found the cast iron kettle still warm from the stove, and held it by the handle like a weapon she did not believe in. They crossed the hall together. The kitchen was narrow and old-fashioned, with deep counters, open shelves, and a long sink set under a rear window. A lamp over the table cast a weak yellow cone. Outside the glass, the yard behind the house sloped toward the trees. The shed crouched about 20 yards away, its roof silvered by cold moonlight breaking through the clouds. Nothing moved. Ethan listened. The refrigerator hummed. Somewhere inside the walls, pipes ticked. The ordinary sounds should have helped. Instead, they made the strange silence beyond them seem even more aware. He checked the back door. Locked. He checked the pantry, then the mudroom, then the narrow washroom off the hall. Empty. The boards underfoot groaned in long, complaining notes. When he opened the cupboard beneath the sink, a draft of colder air brushed his hand. "There's a crawlspace access," he said. Mira stared at the small square wooden hatch cut into the back wall near the floor. It had a ring handle, old brass gone almost black. "Do not open that. I'm not planning to." As if in reply, something touched the other side of the hatch. Not a blow, just contact, a pressure. The faintest scrape of wood against wood. Mira made a sound that was almost a laugh and almost a sob. "No, no, absolutely not." Ethan backed away from the hatch with the poker raised. His pulse had begun beating in the dry inside place of his throat. For the first time, he found himself thinking of the owner's messages. She had been friendly, almost too friendly, quick to answer, oddly insistent that they arrive before dark if possible. He had taken it for the fussiness of someone attached to her family property. Now he remembered the last line she had sent after he booked. "Road gets strange after midnight. Best stay inside once you're settled." At the time he had assumed she was trying to sound charming and rustic. Mira saw his face change. "What?" he told her. She closed her eyes, then opened them. "When were you going to mention that? When it was funny?" "Is it funny?" "No." The house gave a sudden hard creak above them, the sound of weight crossing the second-floor landing. Both of them looked toward the ceiling. There was a bedroom upstairs. 2, maybe. They had only carried their bags into the front room and had not explored beyond the hall closet downstairs. The idea that someone, or something, might now be walking where no one had walked an hour ago made the air feel thin. Ethan moved first, not out of courage, but because standing still had become impossible. "Stay here." Mira stared at him as if he had lost his mind. "That is the dumbest sentence you have ever said." "Fine, come with me." They went to the foot of the stairs and stood listening. Another step from above, then another. Slow, careful, the weight of something that knew the boards in which one spoke. Ethan raised the poker and climbed. Every stair had its own voice. Some muttered, some cracked sharply. The upper landing ran the length of the house, with doors on either side and a narrow window at the far end. Cold moonlight fell through that glass in a white strip across the floorboards. Dust moved in it like powdered bone. The first bedroom stood open. Inside was an iron-framed bed, a washstand, and a wardrobe with one door hanging slightly ajar. Ethan checked behind the wardrobe door, beneath the bed, inside the wardrobe itself. Empty. The second room was smaller, empty again except for a chair facing the window. The third door at the end of the passage was closed. The footsteps had stopped there. Ethan glanced at Mira. Her lips had gone pale. She shifted the kettle to her other hand. "Ready," he whispered. "No." He pushed the door open. The room beyond was an attic space converted years ago into something like a study, sloped ceiling, desk, shelves. A single bed under the eaves, papers stacked in neat old piles, nothing living. Nothing moving. Yet the room did not feel empty, it felt interrupted. The far window stood open by 2 inches. A bitter draft moved the curtain inward and outward in a slow, breathing motion. Mira looked at the window, then at Ethan. "Did you open that?" He shook his head. The latch was rusted. It should have taken force to move it. Yet there it was, just wide enough to let the night look in. Ethan crossed the room and pushed it shut. As he turned the latch, his flashlight beam, still tucked in his pocket from the drive, swept over the desk. There, under a cracked glass paperweight, lay a folded sheet of yellowing paper. He picked it up. There were only 4 lines written in an uneven hand. "If they call from the trees, do not answer. If they scratch at the boards, do not look underneath. If one of them is already inside, keep the lamps lit and wait for morning. Do not follow a voice you love." For a moment Ethan could only stare. Mira took the paper from him, read it, and went very still. "This is not funny," she said. "I know. Tell me the owner staged this." "I know." From outside the house came a sound like someone walking slowly around the porch. Step, step, step. The boards below answered with old hollow knocks. Then, from somewhere near the front door, a woman's voice called softly through the wood. "Hello." Mira's eyes widened. "Did someone follow us?" The voice came again, calm and clear, muffled by the wall. "Can you help me?" It sounded wrong at once, not because the words were strange, but because the tone held no mountain cold, no breathlessness, no uncertainty. It sounded like a voice repeated from memory, smooth and careful, like a sentence practiced in an empty room. Ethan moved to the landing window and peered down toward the porch. Moonlight silvered the railing. The rocking chair stood still. The steps were empty, no one. "Hello," the woman called again, this time from the back of the house. Mira let out a thin breath. No, the voice was the same, not closer, not farther, simply relocated as if distance meant nothing to it. Ethan pulled the study door shut behind them and backed into the hall. Then the woman outside laughed. The laugh bent halfway through into something rough and animal. A second later, something hit the front door hard enough to shake the whole house. Chapter 3, Lamps and Windows. The impact on the front door rolled through the walls like thunder held indoors. Mira gasped. Ethan was already moving, half dragging her down the stairs. He did not know whether he meant to defend the door, reinforce it, or simply keep something from entering while his mind caught up. Fear had narrowed the world to objects and distances. Door, fire, poker table, windows. The front room seemed changed when they reached it. The flames in the fireplace had burned lower. Shadows now moved heavily across the ceiling beams. Every reflective surface held fragments of the room in trembling amber and black. Another blow struck the front door. The wood groaned under it. "Help me," Ethan said. They shoved the narrow hall bench across the entry, then dragged the small table after it. It was not enough. The lock looked ancient. The door itself was thick but old, swollen by weather and age. Ethan wished wildly for a bolt, a bar, anything made by someone who believed a door should survive what waits outside at night. A scratch sounded across the wood at shoulder height, then another lower, then many all at once, rapid and curious. Mira pressed both hands over her mouth. The scratching moved sideways across the door and onto the wall beside it, as if more than one thing was testing the planks with nails or teeth. Ethan stood very still. The fire popped. The clock on the mantel, which neither of them had noticed before, gave a slow tick. Something brushed the front window. He forced himself to look. At first he saw only their own reflection, pale and stiff in the glass. Then a face slid into view outside the pane. Not fully human, not fully anything. It was long and gray and seemed too thin for the skull beneath it, as if the skin had dried there. The eyes were wide and colorless in the dark, reflecting the room in two small wet lights. Where the mouth should have been soft and human, it stretched too far at the corners, almost to the cheeks. The thing pressed one hand to the glass. The fingers were too many. Mira screamed. The face jerked away instantly, not offended, not startled, merely quick. A shape crossed the porch railing with impossible ease. Then another. Then none. Ethan ran to the lamp and turned it higher. The bulb flared, then dimmed, then steadied weakly. He checked the other lamps, lighting everything he could. The room became brighter, but the windows turned into dark mirrors again, and dark mirrors were worse than clear glass. "What are they?" Mira whispered. He had no answer fit for language. The next sound came from the roof. A soft patter at first, like rain beginning, but the sky outside was clear. Then the patter resolved into movement. Something small and light crossed from one side of the roof to the other. A second weight followed, heavier. Claws scraped slate. Something paused directly above the sitting room and gave a low throat-clicking chatter that made the hair rise on Ethan's arms. Mira backed toward the fireplace. "We should get in the car." "And drive where? We barely found the place in daylight." "Anywhere that is not here," he almost agreed. Then he looked through the side window and saw the yard. The gravel drive was visible only in fragments between black tree trunks. Yet in those fragments, one thing became horribly clear. Shapes were standing in the lane now. Not one or two. Several. Tall, motionless, just beyond the reach of the porch light. They were too far away for features, but not too far to mistake for trees. Trees did not lean inward with patient attention. Trees did not change position when you blinked. "We're not making it to the car," he said. Mira followed his gaze and whispered a curse. For a while they could only listen. The house had become an instrument being played from all sides. Scratch at the wall, wait on the roof, a footstep by the kitchen window, a low tapping beneath the floor again, slower now, almost thoughtful. Sometimes everything stopped together for 10 or 15 seconds, and those silences were the most unbearable of all. It was in those pauses that Ethan felt the certainty of watching attention gathered just beyond the light. At last he remembered the note from upstairs. Keep the lamps lit and wait for morning. He fed more wood into the fire. He lit the lamp in the kitchen, then another in the hall. When he opened a drawer for matches, he found 2 thick candles wrapped in wax paper and a short oil lantern with a cloudy glass chimney. Dust covered everything as if it had not been touched in years, yet the lantern was full. Mira stood close behind him now, no longer pretending she would wait in another room. "What if the power goes?" she asked. "Then we use these. What if the fire goes out?" "It won't." "What if they come through the windows?" Ethan turned. "Then we go somewhere with fewer windows." They chose the study upstairs because it had the smallest door and only one narrow window. Carrying supplies while the noises moved around them felt like trying to keep order inside a nightmare. Ethan took the lantern, candles, flashlight, and a kitchen knife. Mira carried blankets, the old note, a bottle of water, and the kettle again because having something solid in her hands helped her breathe. The climb back upstairs felt longer now. Halfway up, the lamp in the hall went out. Not dimmed, not flickered, Out. Mira made a small sound behind him. Ethan turned and looked down. The lower floor sat in uneven light from the kitchen and front room, but the stretch of hallway where the lamp had been was now a pool of blackness. He had the sudden violent certainty that if he stared long enough, something would step out of it and begin to climb toward them without hurry. He did not stare long enough. Inside the study, he set the lantern on the desk and lit it with shaking hands. Warm gold filled the room. He wedged a chair under the doorknob. Mira shut the window latch twice, though it was already closed. Together they pushed the desk a little closer to the door, more for comfort than true protection. Then they waited. Minutes passed, or what felt like minutes. Time had lost its familiar pace. Ethan checked his watch and saw that it was only a little after 11. "Impossible," Mira said when he told her. "Yes." The sounds outside shifted. The scratching at the walls faded. The footsteps on the roof ceased. In their place came something worse, breathing at the door, not from the hallway, from the other side of the wood. Slow inhalation, slow exhalation, a dry, papery sound as if lungs had been made from leaves. Mira's hand found Ethan's and locked there hard enough to hurt. He was grateful for the pain. It kept him anchored. A voice spoke in the corridor. "Ethan." He nearly answered before the note blazed in his mind. "Do not follow a voice you love." The voice was Mira's. She heard it too. Her nails drove into his skin. "Ethan," said the thing outside in the exact soft, tired tone Mira used when waking him in the mornings. "Open the door." He looked at the real Mira. Her face had drained of all color. Again the voice spoke, this time with a little laugh folded into it. "Please, I'm cold." Then, from directly beneath the floorboards under the bed, another voice answered in Ethan's own voice. "So am I." Chapter 4. The journal. Neither of them spoke for a long time after the voice under the bed. The lantern flame trembled in its glass. Beyond the door, the thing wearing Mira's voice gave no further words, but Ethan sensed it lingering there. The floor beneath the bed stayed silent as well, which somehow made that horror worse. Silence suggested patience. Silence suggested certainty. Mira was the first to move. Very slowly, without taking her eyes from the bed, she climbed onto the mattress and folded her feet under her. Ethan followed, lantern in hand. The frame creaked. He imagined fingers reaching up between the slats. He forced the thought away. "Do not look underneath," Mira whispered. "I know. You were going to. I know." The study was cramped enough that the bed nearly touched the far wall under the sloping ceiling. The desk sat near the door, piled with brittle paper. Books lined the shelves in wavering rows, local maps, weather records, botany guides, a family Bible with a split spine, and several notebooks stacked flat. Ethan could not stop himself from looking toward them. If someone had written the note, then someone had known what this night was. Maybe there was more. Maybe there was some practical thing hidden among the warnings, some method. He eased off the bed with the lantern held low. Nothing struck from below. No hand came through the boards. Still, every step toward the desk felt like a negotiation with something unseen. Mira remained on the mattress, clutching the kitchen knife now while the kettle sat forgotten at her feet. "Fast," she whispered. He nodded. The notebooks were cloth-bound and dated over many years. Rainfall, fence repairs, guests. Missing stock, names of birds seen in spring. He flipped through them with rising frustration until he found one without a date on the cover, only a pressed fern gone brown and translucent beneath clear tape. The first pages were calm enough. Notes on weather, repairs to the roof, expenses in a wavering hand. Then the writing changed. It grew tighter, more hurried, with sentences crossed through so hard the nib had torn the paper. June 3. Heard them again from the creek side. 3 voices this time. One was Thomas. June 5. Made the rule list for the renters, though none stay long enough to follow it. June 8. They come closer when the house is dark. June 11. It is not the walls they want, it is invitation. June 14. They are hungry for names, for replies, for an open door, for any gesture that admits them into the shape of a life. Ethan swallowed and turned more pages. There were sketches too, drawn in pencil by a hand no longer steady. Thin bodies, long limbs, heads tilted at the wrong angle. One drawing showed a figure standing beneath the side window, one hand raised, its face turned upward as if listening to the people inside. Another showed a taller shape among trees, antlers or branches fanning from its skull like a crown. Mira made a frightened sound from the bed. "What?" He held the notebook toward her. She looked, then looked away at once. "No, keep going." Later entries were harder to read. There are lesser ones, and there is one they keep behind them. The lesser ones mimic. The taller one remembers. It waits at the edge until fear thins the room. Do not let them gather in the house's blind places. Do not sleep. If the power fails, start the generator before midnight if you can. They dislike the floodlights at the shed and side yard. Not a cure, only distance. After midnight the yard changes. Paths lengthen. Keep to the rope line from porch to shed. If the rope is gone, stay inside and pray for weather. Ethan, read that last line twice. Generator, floodlights, shed. He shut the notebook and went still, hearing the house anew. Somewhere below them, a low electrical hum had gone absent. He had not noticed its presence until now. The room felt dimmer than before, the lantern suddenly a small, frail thing in a house that had once expected stronger light. He glanced at the wall switch beside the door and flicked it. "Nothing. The power's gone," he said. Mira laughed once without humor. "Of course it has." He told her about the generator. She stared as if he had suggested he step into the sea in winter because a coin might be lying in the surf. "No. If the floodlights work, it gives us the yard back. Or it gets you taken by whatever is wearing my voice under the floor." He wanted to argue. Instead, he looked at the window. Outside, the forest was an unbroken black mass. If the note was true, if the journal was true, then night out there was not merely dark. It was active. Yet the thought of sitting until dawn in a shrinking circle of lantern light, while things breathed in the hall and spoke from the floor, was its own kind of madness. He turned more pages. There was a final entry, written with the slant of a hand already falling apart. "If you must go out, go before the house begins making more rooms than it owns. Take torch, lantern, matches. Follow the porch rail to the post. From the post, take the rope to the shed. Do not look into the trees when they whisper. If you see someone you know standing among them, it is not them. If you hear the door behind you open, do not go back for whoever calls your name. Morning writes the distances. Night does not." Mira slid off the bed and came to stand beside him. While he read, the thing in the corridor had left the door. He had not heard it go, which was worse than hearing it remain. "I hate this house," she said quietly. "Same. You are thinking about the shed." "Yes." She shook her head at once. "No." He wanted to say then what frightened him most, that the darkness itself seemed to be deepening by degrees. The corners of the study looked farther away than before. The ceiling above the bed felt a little higher. The house was subtle with it, but the journal's phrase had already rooted in his mind. More rooms than it owns. He settled for honesty. "I don't think sitting here is safer." Mira looked toward the floor, toward the bed, toward the door. She knew he was right. Knowing did not make it easier. "Then I'm coming. If something happens out there, one of us needs to stay inside with light. And if something happens in here," he had no answer. She pressed the notebook into his chest. Then don't be long. He gathered what the entry had named: flashlight, lantern, matches. The kitchen knife he tucked into his belt, though he doubted metal mattered. At the door he stopped and listened. Nothing in the corridor, only the long old hush of beams and boards. Mira caught his sleeve. "Ethan." He turned. "Whatever you hear," she said, each word careful. "If it sounds like me outside, don't follow it. If it sounds like me inside, don't trust it. Just come back to this door and knock 3 times. Slow. Then twice. I'll only open for that." He nodded. The arrangement felt pitifully small against the night, but small things were all they had. He eased the study door open. The landing lay empty under a strip of moonlight from the far window. Yet the air in the corridor was colder than before, carrying a smell like wet leaves turned under in deep earth. Ethan stepped out. Behind him, Mira closed the door with the gentlest click she could manage. He stood alone in the upper hallway, lantern in one hand, torch in the other, listening to the house breathe around him. Then he began to descend into the dark. Chapter 5, the rope to the shed. The lower floor was darker than it had any right to be. The fire in the sitting room still lived, but faintly now, hunched low among the logs. Its light no longer reached the far corners. The kitchen lamp was dead. The hall lamp remained a blind shape on the wall. Shadows pooled in the doorways as if every room held more space than before. Ethan crossed the front room without looking at the windows. That lasted 4 steps. On the 5th, he glanced toward the glass and saw 3 pale faces peering in from the porch. They were not pressed close this time. They stood just beyond the reflection, motionless, heads slightly tilted as if they had been listening to the boards under his feet. The nearest had the shape of a woman from the shoulders down, long hair hanging dark and wet over a white nightdress. But its face was too smooth, unfinished around the mouth and nose, like wax left near a fire. The beam of his flashlight struck the window. All 3 faces vanished at once. He did not run to the front door. He made himself move carefully because panic felt like something the house wanted from him. He checked the bolt. He moved the bench and table aside just enough to open the door. The cold leaking through the seam touched his fingers like water from a cellar. He almost lost his nerve there. Behind him, the house waited. Ahead of him, the yard waited. In either direction lay the same impossible night. Then a sound came from upstairs. Not Mira, a child laughing. It rang once through the hallway, small and delighted, as if from the far end of the landing. Ethan opened the door and stepped out onto the porch. The night hit him whole. Cold, yes, but also vast. The dark beyond the porch was not flat darkness. It had depth and shape and listening in it. The moon moved behind slow, high clouds, casting the yard in pulses of gray and silver. He saw the railing, the steps, the weed-grown path toward the side yard. The rope line stretched from a porch post into the dark toward the shed, exactly where the journal had said. The rope looked old but intact. Good. He set the lantern on the porch floor while he pushed the door nearly shut behind him. Not fully shut. Mira needed to hear him if he came back. The house loomed warm and dim at his back, windows glowing like tired eyes. From the trees came whispering, not words at first. Only the texture of many quiet voices overlapping. Ethan took the lantern in his left hand, the flashlight in his right, and stepped off the porch. The rope was rough beneath his glove. He kept one hand on it and followed. Gravel turned to frozen mud, then to flattened grass silver with frost. The beam of the flashlight cut through low, drifting threads of mist. Each time the wind moved through the pines, the shadows shifted like bodies repositioning. Halfway to the shed, he saw the first figure. It stood to his right at the very edge of the tree line. Tall, bare-limbed, skin pale as fungus growing under bark. Its head was slightly too large for the narrow neck holding it. For a moment he thought it had no face at all. Then the torch beam caught two eyeshine points and the long black opening of a smile. It did not approach. It only walked with him between the trees, keeping exact pace, one hand drifting over trunks as if counting them. Ethan kept his gaze fixed on the rope. The whispering grew clearer. This way. Over here. You dropped something. Ethan. The last was Mira's voice, faint and urgent, spoken from the darkness to his left. He tightened his grip on the rope until the fibers burned his palm. The shed door emerged from the dark sooner than he expected, which frightened him more than if it had taken longer. Distance felt unreliable out here, as if the yard had become elastic. He reached the wall, found the latch, and nearly cried aloud with relief when it lifted at once. Inside, the smell of old fuel and damp wood pressed around him. He swung the lantern higher. Tools hung in neat lines on the walls. A workbench ran beneath a grime-clouded window. Coils of rope, cans of oil, a hatchet, a shovel, bundles of kindling, and at the back, under a tarp, sat the generator. "Thank God," he whispered. The whispering outside stopped. He froze. Silence gathered around the shed so suddenly it felt deliberate. No wind in the trees, no scrape of branches, no night insects, nothing. Then, very softly, someone knocked on the shed wall. 3 slow taps. Mira's signal. For one ecstatic second, hope flared so brightly in him that it almost hurt, but Mira was upstairs. The 3 taps came again, followed by 2. His skin turned cold beneath the cold. "Mira," said Mira's voice from just outside the shed door, as if she had become confused and forgotten her own name. Then, gentler, "Ethan, open." The latch twitched. He sprang across the cramped space and held the door shut with one shoulder. Something on the other side tested the handle again with polite little movements. The restraint of it was monstrous. A wild thing battering the door he could have understood. This patience, this imitation of manners, turned his stomach. He backed away only when the handle stopped moving. The generator was heavy but manageable. Starting it required fuel, a choke lever, and more confidence than he felt. He found a can, splashed some into the tank, nearly dropped the funnel twice, then pulled the starter cord. Nothing. Outside the shed, something moved across the roof in a dry rustle. He pulled again. The engine coughed once and died. A breath sounded under the gap at the bottom of the door. He could see its shadow there, broken by moonlight. Not one pair of feet, several. He pulled the cord a 3rd time with all his strength. The generator caught. It roared to life so suddenly he flinched back. At once the shed bulbs flickered on overhead, harsh white and humming. An instant later, a floodlight burst alive above the door. Another ignited on the side of the house. Then another farther up near the yard, washing the slope in brutal electric glare. Outside, a chorus of thin shrieks rose from the dark. Not pain, anger. He dared a glance through the dirty shed window. The figures nearest the walls had scattered back toward the trees with inhuman speed. In the new light, he saw them more clearly than before and wished he had not. They were shaped like people only in the lazy way smoke can take the form of a face. Too long in the arms. Knees bending backward on some. Skin stretched gray and waxy, patched with darker marks that might once have been clothing or might have belonged to them naturally. Their heads snapped toward the light with sudden bird-like motions. One crawled rather than ran, yet moved fastest of all. And at the wood line, untouched by panic, stood something taller. It did not retreat. Its body was draped in hanging strips the color of rotten bark. Branches, antlers, or both rose from its head. The floodlight found no shine in its face. It remained black there, like a hood with no features inside. One hand rested lightly on a pine trunk as it watched the shed. The journal's phrase returned to Ethan with sick clarity. There is one they keep behind them. The taller thing lifted its head, not toward the light, toward the house, and from somewhere above the roar of the generator came a single human scream. Mira. Chapter 6. Broken Thresholds. Ethan was already at the door before the scream had fully left the air. He yanked it open and ran. The rope line whipped against his hand as he tore across the yard, lantern banging against his leg, flashlight beam lurching wildly over gravel and frost. The floodlights carved the property into brutal islands of white and black. In the black between them, movement kept pace, forms slipping from trunk to trunk, crouching low, vanishing when the beam caught them. The tall antlered shape remained at the tree line, still watching, as if it had no need to hurry. The porch steps struck beneath Ethan's boots. He slammed through the front door and shouted Mira's name. No answer. The sitting room fire had burned nearly to embers, but the side yard floodlight now spilled through the windows in a hard slant, turning every floating speck of ash and dust into a sharp white fleck. The house looked flayed open. There was no comfort left in it. Mira! From upstairs came the sound of something heavy hitting a wall, then a chair scraping. Then Mira's voice, raw with panic. Ethan? He took the stairs 3 at a time. The landing was brighter now with the exterior lights blasting through the far window. The study door stood open. The chair he had wedged beneath the knob lay overturned in the hall. Inside the room, the window was open wide. The curtains snapped inward on a blade of night air. Papers stormed across the floor. Mira stood pressed against the sloping wall beneath the eaves with the kitchen knife raised in one shaking hand. Between her and the window crouched one of the pale things, half in the room, half on the sill. It turned when Ethan entered. Up close it was worse than outside. Its body seemed assembled from guesses about human shape. Shoulders too narrow, joints wrong. The skin on its face lay tight over a skull that shifted beneath, as if still deciding what expression it wanted. Its mouth opened not downward but sideways, parting into a long, wet line that showed small, square teeth like those of a child's toy. Ethan hit it with the poker. He did not remember picking the poker up from downstairs. Somehow it was in his hand, and somehow it found the creature's shoulder with a crack that felt more like striking bundled sticks than flesh. The thing made a high, sharp sound and launched itself backward through the window in a movement so fast the eye refused it. For an instant, it clung to the outer wall by hands and feet like a spider. Then it dropped into the dark below. Mira sank to the floor. Ethan crossed to her at once. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head too quickly. Her breath was broken into ragged pieces. "I heard you, the knock. 3 and 2, I heard you." "I didn't knock." "I know that now." He pulled her up. Her sleeve was torn, but her skin beneath it showed only a red scrape where the window latch must have caught her as she fought. No bite. No blood except a thin line from her palm where she had gripped the knife too hard. Relief hit him so hard his knees nearly failed. What happened? Her eyes kept darting to the open window. He shut it, latched it, dragged the desk hard against it, then turned back to her. "It knocked," she said. "Your knock. Exact. Then it said the generator was on and you needed me to help pull the other line by the side of the house. It sounded like you. Tired, annoyed, exactly like you. I opened the door and there was nothing there. Then I heard breathing behind me and the window was open." The study felt suddenly too small to hold all their fear. Outside, along the wall below, something scratched once and moved away. "The floodlights pushed them back," Ethan said. "Not far enough, but it helps." Mira gave a short nod, trying to force herself into steadiness. "Then we keep the generator alive." As if summoned by the words, the roar outside dipped, surged, dipped again. Ethan and Mira stared at each other. "No," he said. The generator coughed once from the shed. The floodlight outside the side yard blinked, came back, blinked again. Then from below the house came the dry, dragging noise once more, louder now, spreading under the floorboards like a body rolling through narrow earth. Mira gripped his wrist. "What if they can stop it? Then we go down and bring the lanterns and whatever fuel we can back up here." The engine outside sputtered once more, then steadied. For the moment, they did not return to the bed. They stayed on their feet in the center of the study, as far from door and window as possible, listening. Ethan kept the journal tucked under his arm as if it were more than paper. He read the entries again in fragments, searching for something overlooked. There, in a margin note half erased by time, "They cannot cross a true threshold unless called, but the house has old thresholds and broken ones. Windows count when opened from within. Crawl spaces count if the boards are lifted. Mirrors count if you believe what they show." He read that sentence 3 times. "Mirrors," Mira said. "There's one in the downstairs hall. And one in the washroom. And the bedroom wardrobe." He hated at once how many reflecting surfaces he had already passed without thought. In a house built on old superstitions, ordinary objects could become doorways through belief alone. He did not know whether he believed that. He only knew he no longer trusted the difference between belief and danger. A soft knock came from the wardrobe in the first bedroom across the hall, then another from inside the wardrobe. Mira shut her eyes briefly. "I don't think mourning is real anymore." "It is." "How do you know?" "Because they keep trying to stop us getting there." That was as close to courage as either of them managed. The next hour stretched like wire. The generator faltered twice and recovered. The floodlights held. The things outside grew less bold in the yard but more inventive at the edges. Sometimes a face appeared at the landing window from impossible height, hanging there upside down for the space of a blink. Sometimes footsteps hurried from one end of the roof to the other and stopped directly above them. Once someone wept softly in the bedroom across the hall, a man's voice thick with grief, repeating the same broken sentence over and over. "I shouldn't have opened it. I shouldn't have opened it." Then, just after 1 in the morning, the house changed. It began with a door that should not have existed. Ethan opened the study a crack to listen to the hall more clearly. The landing beyond lay under the same strip of moonlight, but halfway down the corridor on the left wall, there was now another door between the smaller bedroom and the linen closet. He knew there had been no door there. He had walked the hall twice already. Mira saw his face and looked past him. "No," she whispered. "No." The new door was painted the same faded cream as the walls, brass knob, old wood frame. Perfectly natural if one had not known the house half an hour earlier. Something tapped politely from the other side. "Morning writes the distances," the journal had said. "Night does not." Ethan shut the study door and slid the chair harder under the handle. "What now?" Mira asked. He looked at the lantern, the candles, the notebook, the knife, the dim room, the window with the desk pressed against it, and beyond all that the idea of a house slowly growing more places for the dark to stand in. He answered with the only truth he had. "We stay ahead of it." Chapter 7. The cellar threshold staying ahead of the house turned out to mean moving before fear locked them in place. The study no longer felt defensible. Too small. Too dependent on one door and one window. If more false doors could appear in the corridor, if the house itself had begun rearranging its emptiness, then being cornered under the eaves was only waiting to be chosen. "We need more light," Ethan said. "We need a priest." "That too." Mira almost smiled, and the broken almost smile steadied both of them more than any brave speech could have done. They wrapped the lantern glass in a scarf for the trip downstairs so the light would not blow out in a draft. Ethan took one blanket to throw over mirrors if he found them. Mira carried the candles. Together they slipped into the hall. The new door remained. It was shut now. The brass knob shone faintly in the moonstrip. As they moved past, something inside made the unmistakable sound of a hand sliding slowly down the inner panel, a soft trailing scrape from shoulder height to floor. Neither of them looked directly at it. The first bedroom lay dark and empty. The wardrobe door that had been closed before now stood open a finger's width. Ethan tossed the blanket over the wardrobe mirror as he passed without checking the interior. The cloth fell and settled. At once, a dull thud came from inside the wardrobe, as though something had leaned its weight against the wood in disappointment. The landing window showed the side yard floodlight blazing across the slope. In that hard white field, they could see the rope line, the shed, the nearest pines, and beyond them only a wall of night. For a moment, Ethan thought the tall, antlered figure had gone. Then he realized it was standing directly behind a tree, perfectly aligned with the trunk, so that only its branch crown projected from either side like dead limbs. The thing knew it had been seen. It did not move. Downstairs, the front room had sunk into a miserable half-light. The fire was almost gone. Ethan fed it wood until flames rose again. Mira lit 2 candles and set them on the mantel. When she turned toward the hall, she froze. The long mirror hanging there reflected the corridor, the staircase, and the front room behind them. It also reflected 6 people standing in the hall. Ethan saw them at the same moment, and all the warmth left his body. In the real hall, there was nothing. In the mirror, pale figures crowded shoulder to shoulder where the darkness pooled. Some were tall, some small. One wore what looked like a child's school coat from another century. One had a woman's braid over one shoulder. One had no visible face at all, only a smooth oval tilted with curiosity. They were not moving toward Ethan and Mira in the room. They were looking past the reflection, deeper into the house, as if waiting for something farther inside to arrive. Mira lunged forward and dropped the blanket over the mirror. The reflected hall vanished. The candle flames shuddered hard enough that wax spilled over her fingers. For several seconds, neither of them said a word. Then, from under the blanket, the mirror gave a gentle single tap. Ethan went into the kitchen and found more cloths, old tea towels, a table runner, anything large enough to cover glass. Together they worked through the lower floor. Washroom mirror covered, china cabinet doors draped, window over the sink curtained with a heavy towel. Only the front and side windows in the sitting room remained exposed because the floodlights outside mattered more than hiding the glass. What if belief is enough? Mira whispered, nodding toward the windows. Then we keep believing in sunrise. She huffed a breath that might have been laughter. At the pantry, Ethan paused. The crawlspace hatch waited under the lowest shelf. He remembered the note, "Do not look underneath." But the dragging beneath the floor had grown louder. Sometimes it seemed to move from kitchen to hall to sitting room in smooth, impossible paths. If there were weak places under the house, if something was already using them, then ignorance was not helping. Mira saw where he was looking. No, it might not be just a crawl space. And it might be a straight path to the worst thing in this mountain. He crouched anyway and pressed his ear to the wood. For a moment there was only the throb of his own pulse. Then, very faintly, he heard something like bells, not church bells, tiny ones, hanging close together and stirring in a slow underground draft. He lifted his head. There's something down there. Wonderful. Leave it there. But the journal had mentioned blind places. If the house had places below the floor full of old bells and maybe old protections, then those mattered. Ethan looked around the pantry. On the shelf above the hatch sat a jar of rock salt. Beside it hung a ring of dried herbs so dusty they might have lost their names. Behind the flour tin, he found a stub of white chalk and, folded under a dishcloth, a little iron charm made of twisted nails. Someone had been trying. He showed Mira. Her face changed from fear to something harder. Okay. Together, they set the lantern on the pantry floor. Ethan lifted the hatch ring. At once, the bells below stirred more clearly. The hatch opened onto narrow wooden steps dropping into darkness. Cold, earthy air rose around them, carrying the smell of roots, damp stone, and old metal. The walls below were lined with rough fieldstone. This was no simple crawl space. It was a root cellar or foundation chamber from the older house beneath the newer one. Mira stayed at Ethan's shoulder as they descended. The cellar ceiling was low enough that he had to duck. Shelves ran along one wall, long empty except for dusty jars, a rusted water can, and bundles of herbs turned black with age. On the far side, small handbells hung from wire strung between beams, dozens of them, tarnished green and brown. Salt had been poured in a line along the threshold of an inner alcove. Chalk marks ringed the stone there in symbols Ethan did not know. At the center of the alcove stood a little wooden stool with a Bible, a box of matches, and a lantern whose glass was broken. "Someone stayed down here," Mira said, "for nights like this." There were more notebooks, too, stored in a tin box on the lower shelf. Ethan opened one at random. The first readable page said only, "They were here before the road, before the fence, before the house." The first cabin burned. The second stood because a threshold was made. "We keep it. We feed no names to the trees." Another, "The bells are not to harm them, only to tell where the boundary trembles." As if to answer, 3 bells near the ceiling gave a soft chiming tremor. Not from wind, from movement above them. Dust fell from the joists. Something heavy crossed the kitchen floor overhead. Then something else, lighter, quicker, circling the pantry hatch. Ethan and Mira looked up together. The lantern light fluttered across the beams and bells. A third note in the tin box, written on a torn envelope flap, read, "If they come into the house before dawn, the cellar threshold will hold only while the salt line remains unbroken. Do not let them speak to you from the stair." Mira's hand found the salt jar in Ethan's grip. "We bring this down now. Everything useful." They moved fast, making 2 trips between cellar and pantry with lights, blankets, food, water, and firewood for the lantern and candles. Each climb up the steps felt like surfacing into a worse version of the house. On the second trip, the new door upstairs was gone. In its place, the wall stood blank and innocent. That frightened Ethan more than its presence had. On the third trip, while he was reaching for the last candle box, something whispered from the hallway in his dead mother's voice, "You forgot your coat, sweetheart." He nearly dropped the matches. Mira heard it too. She looked at him, and he saw from her face that she understood exactly how that voice could cut. She pressed the salt jar into his hands and said, very softly and very firmly, "Not tonight." They returned to the cellar and drew the hatch down above them. For the first time since arriving at the house, they had stone around them instead of thin old boards. For the first time, Ethan almost believed they might last until morning. Then something began to scratch on the underside of the hatch, not with nails this time, but with the delicate, patient sound of fingertips tracing where the salt line on the stair should end. Chapter 8. The bells under the house, the scratching on the hatch, continued for so long that it began to alter the mind. At first, Ethan counted each pass of the unseen fingers, each slow drag across the wood above their heads. After a while, the counting broke. Time dissolved into the lantern glow, the stone chill of the cellar, the salt line drawn bright at the inner alcove, and the soft movement of bells whenever the boundary trembled. Mira sat on the little stool with the Bible closed in her lap, not reading but holding it because old hands had held it here before. Ethan stood nearest the stair with the poker across his knees, watching the salt line as if attention alone could keep its grains from shifting. The voices on the other side of the hatch changed often. Sometimes they murmured words too low to catch. Sometimes they knocked exactly 3 and then 2. Sometimes a man coughed on the stair in a way so ordinary that Ethan's body answered before his mind did, because it was the sound of another living human being in distress. Each time, the bells hanging from the beams gave a tiny warning tremor, and the tremor reminded him what waited beyond the wood. Around 2 in the morning, the voices grew bolder. "Mira," her father called from the stair in a tired voice. "Open up now. Enough nonsense." She bent forward sharply as if struck. Ethan went to her, but she raised one hand to stop him and pressed the other over her eyes until the voice passed into a dry chuckle and became something else. Later, a child cried for its mother from just above the hatch. The crying went on in helpless little catches that made the stone room feel smaller and meaner with every second. Ethan wanted to hate the thing making the sound. What he felt instead was exhaustion mixed with pity, and that frightened him in a deeper way. Pity could move the hand that fear had frozen. Mira heard the shift in his breathing. "No, I know. You were listening too closely. I know." She took the poker from him and held it herself for a while. They read more from the notebooks in turns, partly for knowledge and partly to keep a human voice in the room. The entries came from different years, maybe different members of the same family. Some described ordinary life on the mountain, repairs, weather, births, illness. Others spoke about the things outside with the plainness of people who had no energy left for disbelief. There are nights when they are only curious and nights when they are starving. Storms make them hungry. So does grief in the house. Never build a new doorway on the north wall. A guest once invited his wife in through the window because he thought she had locked herself out. It wore her face for half an hour before the bells told us what he had done. They remember houses that no longer stand. Sometimes they knock on rooms burned 50 years ago. The tall one does not mimic. It waits for you to do the mimicry yourself. It makes you answer what should be left unanswered. Mira read that last line twice. "What does that mean?" she asked. Ethan thought of the way fear had made him imagine footsteps, faces, rescue. Maybe it means they don't force the door, they get you to finish opening it. A bell above the stair gave a delicate, clear note, then another, then 3 together. Something had come down onto the hatch itself. Its weight bowed the wood inward with a long complaint. Dust sifted from the frame. Mira snatched up the salt jar. Ethan lifted the lantern higher. The hatch creaked. A thin crack opened between wood and frame, not from the latch giving way but from pressure from above. Through that crack slid a strip of darkness blacker than the dark around it, like wet cloth pushed beneath a door. The bells nearest the stair erupted into frantic little chiming. Ethan lunged forward and threw his shoulder against the hatch from below. The wood slammed back into place. Something on the other side hissed, not in pain but in surprise. The weight shifted. Nails or claws rasped once across the boards. "Salt," he gasped. Mira poured a second line across the step edge under the hatch. He could not have said why he believed in it except that the people before him had believed and survived long enough to write. That was enough. The pressure from above eased. Then a voice came through the crack, very close now, not loud, not distorted. Mira's voice, soft and tired and affectionate. "Ethan, you can rest. I'll watch." He shut his eyes hard and pushed his shoulder harder against the hatch. The wood chilled through his jacket. He could feel the grain of it, the ancient trapped cold. The voice changed at once to his own. "You can trust me." Then to a whisper from somewhere between ages and sexes. "Open." When it realized the words would not work, it laughed in many voices at once and dropped away. The bells slowly stilled. After that, the cellar no longer felt like a refuge. It felt like a line being tested. Ethan and Mira began making small practical plans because planning was better than imagining. They counted matches. They checked the lantern oil. They divided the remaining candles. They found an old storm lamp on the shelf and got it working too. They ate a few dry crackers they did not want. Ethan forced Mira to drink water. She forced him to sit for 5 minutes with his eyes closed while she watched the stair. In one notebook's back pages, Ethan found a rough map of the property and the slope behind it. A path, barely marked, led not down the drive but up along the eastern ridge to an abandoned fire watch platform. A line beside it read, "If the house fails, make for the east clearing. Dawn reaches there first," he showed Mira. "So we may have to leave," she said. "Yes." "In this?" "Yes." She considered that in silence. "Then before the dark gets thinner and tricks us into thinking it's easier." "It says dawn reaches there first." "If we can tell which way east still is." That was the question he had not wanted to say aloud. The map was old. The land might not match it anymore. The journal warned that paths lengthened after midnight. Still, a direction existed, and that mattered. Morning was not just a clock now. It was a place. Around 3, the generator outside gave a long, uneven cough. The floodlight leaking through cracks in the hatch and foundation planks dimmed, then brightened, then dimmed again, much more severely. Ethan stood at once. "Fuel." Mira rose too. "No, if it dies, the yard goes black and they come closer. They're already on the hatch, which means they're splitting between here and the shed. The lights matter." The generator coughed a second time. This time the bells along the stair gave a nervous ringing even though nothing touched the hatch. The boundary itself seemed to feel the weakness. Mira looked at the old map. Then at Ethan. She had gone beyond arguing into the harder country of deciding between terrible choices. "If you go," she said, "you take the map. If you don't come back in 10 minutes, I'm leaving through the route passage if there is one." "There isn't one." "Then I'll make one." He almost smiled at that, because it sounded like her and only her. He took the fuel can, the flashlight, and the lantern again. Before climbing the stair, he looked back once. Mira stood in the lantern glow with the salt jar in one hand and the poker in the other, a blanket around her shoulders, exhausted and fierce. The cellar bells shone dully above her like a row of watchful eyes. 10 minutes, she said. He nodded and lifted the hatch. The house above was silent. That silence frightened him more than all the voices together. He climbed into it anyway. Chapter 9. The yard without distance, the kitchen was empty. The pantry shelves, the sink, the dead lamp above the table, all exactly where they should be. Yet the air held the aftermath of presence, the way a room can feel occupied even when no one stands inside it. Ethan kept the lantern high and listened. No footsteps, no whispering, no scratch beneath the floor. Only the distant sputter of the generator and, from somewhere overhead, a soft, slow thump as if something large had turned over in sleep. He stepped into the hallway. The front room was lit by broken pulses from the floodlights outside. Every time the generator stumbled, the windows dimmed and shadows surged across the walls. The bench and little table still leaned against the front door. One had shifted several inches, though neither Ethan nor Mira had touched it. The mirror in the hall remained covered, but under the cloth something moved very gently, not tapping now, merely altering the outline as if faces were pressing up from the reflected side. Ethan did not stop. At the front door, he hesitated only long enough to hear the generator choke again. Then he slipped outside. The yard had changed. He knew at once and hated that he knew. The porch steps were where they should be. The shed floodlight still burned. But the space between house and shed looked longer than before, the slope steeper, the rope line sagging at an angle as if stretched by weight. The nearest pine stood farther back from the house, leaving too much open ground and too much visibility, which meant too much room for something to stand in. The mist had returned and moved low over the yard like breath on cold glass. Ethan took the porch rail with one hand, found the rope with the other, and felt only frayed ends. The line had been cut. For a second, his body went numb. The old journal had been clear: after midnight the yard changed. Follow the rope line to the shed. Without it, every step became a guess in land that no longer obeyed itself. The generator coughed again. He looked at the shed. It stood in hard white light, close enough to reach in seconds if distance were honest. Between them lay frost-silvered ground and drifting strips of mist. The path should have been simple. The fact that the house had already taught him otherwise made the simple path sinister. He could go back to the cellar, lose the lights, hope the threshold held, or he could cross. Ethan lifted the flashlight beam and aimed it at the shed door. The cone of light looked weak beside the flood lamps. Along the edge of the yard, pale shapes moved among the trees, not advancing but repositioning, making sure he knew they were there. All except the tall one. The tall one was nowhere visible. That worried him more than seeing it would have. He stepped off the porch and headed straight for the shed, counting his paces under his breath. 1, 2, 3, 4. The ground gave underfoot with a softness it had not held before, as if a thick layer of pine needles now covered the yard. But there had been no such layer. He looked down briefly and saw not needles but old leaves, wet and black, the kind that gather in forest hollows over years. He looked back at the house. It was already farther away than 5 steps should have made it. "No," he whispered. 5, 6, 7. Something moved in the mist ahead. A child emerged, standing directly in his path. It wore a wool coat with brass buttons and held a toy wooden horse by one leg. The child's head was bowed so that its face lay hidden by a cap. At first glance, it seemed heartbreakingly human. Lost, cold, impossible but human. Then it lifted its head. The face beneath the cap was smooth as unpainted clay, with the suggestion of features trying to form under the surface. Ethan veered left without slowing. The child turned to follow him, not with feet but with its whole body pivoting at once, horse dangling from one hand. It spoke in a clear, delighted voice that belonged nowhere near that blank face. "This way is shorter." He kept walking. The mist thickened around his knees. By the count of his steps, he should have reached the shed already. Instead, the floodlight above it looked no nearer than before. Behind him, the house had receded into a dim amber block half hidden by white vapor. Panic scraped at the inside of his ribs. Morning writes the distances. Night does not. He stopped. The moment he stopped, the yard answered. Whispering rose from all sides, not loud but immediate, as though mouths had opened around the edge of the mist. The child in the coat vanished. A woman stood where it had been, then a man. Then no one. Shapes passed through the vapor without sound, joining and separating. Ethan forced himself to look down at the ground. Under the lantern glow, in the leaf litter that should not have existed, lay a line of iron nails hammered into the earth at intervals, half rusted, almost buried. Old markers. He remembered the twisted nail charm from the pantry, boundaries. He crouched and found another nail ahead of the first, then another. A path, not to the shed. upward toward the eastern side of the property. His pulse hammered. The old house had used more than one guide rope. Or perhaps the first house had marked the ridge long before the current yard existed. Either way, the nails gave direction where the yard no longer did. The generator gave a final ugly sputter. The floodlight on the shed dimmed to orange, then to a sick, weak white. From the woods came a thin chorus of hungry excitement. Ethan had seconds. He made his choice and ran not to the shed, but along the line of buried nails toward where the map had marked the eastern clearing. If he could find the route in the altered yard now, he could take Mira by it later. If he wasted himself at the shed and failed, they would lose both the lights and the path. He ran uphill through mist and frost and impossible dark, following the nails whenever he could glimpse them. The whispers around him sharpened. Left, wrong way, she's alone, she's calling. Then Mira screamed, not from the house, from ahead of him in the dark. Ethan stopped dead. Again her voice cried out, raw with terror, much closer now, somewhere just beyond the next rise. He knew with horrible certainty that the sound could not be true. Yet the human part of him, the oldest part, the immediate part, urged toward it before thought could lay a hand on its shoulder. He stumbled 2 steps uphill. A bell rang, tiny, far off, underground, the cellar bells. He had heard them often enough now that his body recognized the sound before his mind did. The noise came not from the dark ahead, but from memory carried through the open foundation vents of the house behind him. That meant the real Mira was still in the cellar, and the cry in front of him was only night speaking too cleverly. He turned hard to the right, back toward the faintest glimpse of the house. Something large crossed the mist between him and the light. It unfolded upward as it moved, rising from a crouch into impossible height. Branches or antlers spread from its skull. The hanging strips draped from its body stirred without wind. In the floodlight's dying wash he still could not see a face, only depthless shadow where a face should have been. The tall one. It stepped once toward him. The ground under Ethan's boots turned abruptly from leaves to porch boards. He had not moved. The house had come to meet him. He lurched sideways and found himself back at the front steps, as if the yard had folded like paper. The porch rail slammed against his hip. The front door stood inches away, still cracked from his leaving. Beyond the gap lay the dim front room. The tall figure remained below the steps in the mist. At last he saw its hands. They were human hands. Old, elegant, almost gentle, with soil packed black under the nails. One hand lifted and pointed not at Ethan but at the open door behind him. Invitation. Completion. The thing did not want to drag him out into the dark. It wanted him to choose wrong on the threshold. Ethan slammed the door shut, dropped the bolt, and staggered back into the room with the map clenched in his fist and the taste of frozen iron in his mouth. The generator died. Outside, every floodlight went black at once. And from somewhere deep in the house, something began coming down a staircase that did not belong there. Chapter 10. The staircase in the wall darkness crashed into the house like water through broken glass. For one stunned second, Ethan could see nothing except the ember glow from the fireplace and the thin, dull eye of his lantern in his own hand. Then shapes returned by degrees, the benches at the door, the draped mirror in the hall, the black mouth of the kitchen. But the loss of the floodlights changed everything. The outside dark no longer stayed outside. It leaned at the windows. It filled the seams around the doors. It pooled along the ceiling beams. Then came the steps. Not on the main staircase. From somewhere behind the kitchen wall where no staircase should have been. A descending tread. Slow. Measured. Wood answering under a great familiar weight. Each step sounded older than the house itself, as though something were coming down through layers of previous rooms, previous years, previous versions of shelter. Ethan did not wait to understand. He ran for the pantry. "Mira," he shouted as he yanked the hatch open. "We have to move." Her face appeared below in lantern light, white with strain. She had heard the generator die. She had heard the new steps too. He could see it in her eyes. "Is the path real?" she asked. "I found markers. Maybe. Enough to try." "Good enough." Another step sounded from the hidden staircase in the wall. Dust shook from the kitchen ceiling. Ethan climbed down into the cellar, grabbed the second lantern, the water, the notebook tin, and shoved the map into his jacket pocket. Mira snatched up the poker and salt. They were halfway back up the stair when something touched the pantry floorboards above the hatch. Not a foot. A hand. Fingers slid over the crack between hatch and frame with a slow, intimate curiosity, feeling for the edge. Mira stopped dead. The hand was human-sized, pale in the lamplight leaking up from below. The fingers were beautiful in shape and very dirty at the tips. Soil fell in tiny black grains between the boards. The tall one. Ethan pushed the hatch hard. The fingers did not withdraw. For an instant he felt resistance on the other side, not brute force but deliberate measured pressure. The hand seemed to be considering him. Then, with terrible calm, the fingers bent and tapped the wood 3 times. Mira threw a fistful of salt upward through the widening crack. The hand snatched back at once. Ethan drove the hatch open and surged into the pantry with the lantern raised high. The room was empty. Empty except for a trail of dark, wet prints crossing the floor toward the kitchen. Bare feet. Human feet. Too many. "Go," he said. They ran. The hidden staircase in the kitchen wall had become visible now, exactly where there had once been shelves of preserves. A strip of wallpaper hung torn aside, revealing a steep, narrow staircase descending into a blackness thicker than shadow. Cold air poured from it, carrying the smell of soaked earth, old smoke, and something sweet gone rotten. The steps below were slick with mud as though many feet had used them tonight. Something was climbing up from beneath. They passed the opening just as a face rose level with the kitchen floor. It was Ethan's own face, or near enough to freeze him. Same eyes, same nose, same mouth. But the expression sat wrong, stretched too wide with a secret delight he had never worn. Soil clung to the cheeks. The copped eyes looked directly into his and widened in recognition. "Don't run," it said in his voice. "You'll miss." Mira hit it with the poker. The thing fell backward into the dark stairs with a chatter of teeth and a sound like laughter broken on stone. Ethan did not look again. They tore through the hall into the front room where the fire had nearly died. He caught a blanket from the sofa, threw it over his shoulders and then around Mira from behind so they both held one end like a cloak against the cold. The front windows showed only black beyond the glass now, their reflections bright with the room's last embers. A knock came at the front door. Soft. Friendly. Then the exact voice of the woman from the first night of their rental messages drifted through the wood. "Road gets strange after midnight." A dozen other voices whispered the line after her, smiling around the words. The draped hall mirror bulged inward under its cloth, as if someone on the other side pressed 2 hands flat and leaned. A crack split one of the front window panes, then another. Hairline fractures spread across the glass in pale, branching veins. Ethan shoved the bench away and put his hand on the bolt. Mira stared at him. "Are you insane? The path markers start outside. The house is done." As if to prove him right, the hidden staircase behind the kitchen gave a deep wooden groan, and multiple feet began hurrying up together from below. Ethan drew the bolt. Cold night flooded the doorway before he even pulled it fully open, and with the cold came whispering from all sides. He dragged Mira through the gap, slammed the door behind them, and they plunged off the porch into the starless dark. No floodlights remained. Only the lanterns and the weak flashlight carved little islands ahead of them. The house behind was a hulking, darker shape against dark, its windows pulsing with the last dying ember glow. From within came knocks, then voices, then the sound of furniture overturning in rooms no longer theirs. "Markers," Mira breathed. Ethan swept the torch over the ground and found the first rusted nail half buried by the step, then another uphill. They ran. The mountain cold tore at their throats. Frost slicked the ground. Once Mira slipped, and Ethan caught her by the elbow without stopping. Behind them, the front door of the house opened slowly on its own with a long, complaining cry. Neither looked back until the third marker. When they did, they saw pale forms spilling from the porch and side yard in loose, silent numbers, not running like animals but gliding with ugly human haste over the slope. Some moved on two legs, some on all fours, some in low, bent postures that made no natural sense. They spread outward rather than following directly, angling through the trees to reach the ridge above. They were herding. "The east clearing," Ethan said. "If the map's true, dawn hits there first." "If the map is lying, I'll haunt you." "Fair." The nails led into forest. Real forest now, not yard, the pines thick and close, roots twisting through the path. The air under the branches was colder still. Their lantern light flashed over trunks scarred with old chalk marks and strips of cloth nailed to bark. Others had run this way. Others had marked it. That meant the path had worked at least once. Then the whispering changed. It no longer came from all around. It came from ahead. The figures in the dark had gotten there first. Between the trees, two pale shapes stepped silently into the path. Mira swung the poker. Ethan raised the lantern. The nearer thing recoiled from the flame enough for them to push past, but the second reached toward Mira with a hand shaped almost like a woman's hand. On one finger gleamed a silver ring exactly like the one Mira wore. She faltered. "Don't," Ethan snapped. That 1 second of hesitation nearly cost them. The creature's copped hand brushed the blanket around her shoulders, and for an instant the fabric frosted white where it touched. Mira gasped and jerked free. Ethan drove the lantern at its face. It hissed and ducked away, skin shrinking from the heat, and they ran on. The path climbed. Branches clawed at them. Stones shifted underfoot. The house noises faded behind and below, replaced by the forest's own terrible quiet. Sometimes they heard movement pacing them among the trees. Once, Ethan saw the tall one between trunks uphill, not blocking the path but watching it like a host waiting at the end of a hall. The markers began to space farther apart. That frightened him more than losing them would have. It felt like the path itself was stretching, offering more dark between certainties. Mira was breathing too hard now. How much farther? He did not know. The map had become smudged in his pocket. The journal's line about morning reaching the clearing first now seemed like the cruel hope of someone who had needed a sentence to hold on to. Then through the trees ahead appeared open sky. Not much, just a pale strip where the pines broke. They had reached some kind of ridge, and standing in the middle of that opening, antlers cutting into the stars, was the tall one waiting for them at last. Chapter 11. The east clearing. The clearing was smaller than Ethan had imagined. Not a meadow, not safety, only a flattened shelf of rock and sparse grass where the trees had pulled back from the ridge enough to reveal the valley and a strip of sky above the eastern mountains. In the center stood the rotted remains of the old fire watch platform shown on the map, little more than a waist-high ring of beams and one leaning ladder. Frost silvered everything. The tall one stood between them and the open rock. Behind it, the east horizon was still black, but a thinner black now, edged somewhere far away with the idea of coming gray. "It got here first," Mira said. Her voice had gone flat with exhaustion. The lesser creatures moved through the trees behind them, forming a ragged half-circle. They did not rush. The path had done its work. The couple had been driven where the night wanted them. Ethan lifted the lantern higher. The tall one did not retreat from the flame as the others had. It only inclined its head slightly, studying the light, then Ethan, then Mira. Up close, it was both less and more monstrous than he had expected. The antlers were not antlers, but roots and branches fused together into a crown of dead wood. The hanging strips draped from its body were old garments, scraps of many decades layered over one another and darkened by damp and soil. Beneath them was a shape like a tall, starved person wrapped in bark. Its hands remained painfully human. Its face was still shadow, yet from that shadow came no mouth, no eyes, only a density that seemed to swallow the lantern glow. Mira stepped closer to Ethan. "What does it want?" The answer came in neither words nor sound at first, but in a pressure in the clearing, as if all the attention of the forest had drawn inward to one point. Then the tall one spoke. Its voice was not a mimicry of anyone they knew. That made it worse. It sounded old and calm and almost sad. "This was a house before your house," it said. Every lesser creature in the trees went still. Ethan felt the world tip slightly under his feet. The thing had language, not borrowed phrases. Language. "You don't belong here," he said, because it was the only sentence available to him. The shadow where its face should have been turned toward the ruined platform. "Neither do you." Then it took one measured step sideways, opening a view of the rock ring beyond. At the center of the ruin lay a black pit covered with boards and wire. Bells hung around it from posts driven into stone, dozens more like those in the cellar, though most had rusted through. On the nearest beam someone had carved words too weathered to read. Mira whispered, "What is that?" Ethan did not know, but something in him answered before thought threshold. The tall one lifted one hand toward the pit, not in invitation exactly, but in demonstration. "This kept peace," it said. "Then your kind forgot what it promised." The voice of the thing held no rage, only endurance worn thin by repetition. Ethan's fear remained absolute, but some other feeling moved beneath it now. Not sympathy. Something more dangerous, the sense that horror might have reasons. That the world might contain old bargains broken long before he arrived. The lesser ones in the trees began whispering again, not to Ethan and Mira but among themselves, restless with the speaking. Mira gripped his sleeve. "Do not start understanding it." She was right. Understanding could become agreement, and agreement could become a step forward that opened some old door. "Still," he asked, "what promise?" The tall one angled its head. "Names for shelter, fire for winter, respect for boundaries, then walls, roads, locks, then laughter." Images flickered through Ethan's mind with unwanted clarity. Settlers on the ridge, the first cabin, local stories dismissed, rituals neglected, landlords renting old houses to strangers who knew nothing about where they slept. The couple's weekend escape suddenly felt indecently small against whatever history had settled in these woods. "That still doesn't give you the right," Mira said. Her voice shook, but it held. "You hunted us." At that, something like movement passed through the shadow of the tall one's face, a smile perhaps, or grief. "You entered a door already open," it said. Behind them the lesser creatures pressed closer between the pines. Lantern light showed their pale hands on trunks, their heads bending in unison. Ethan realized the speaking had not been mercy. It had been delay. The tall one had wanted them tired, listening, standing on the edge of its chosen place. He looked at the pit, the bells, the ruined platform. The old threshold here had once mattered. Maybe it still did. Maybe that was why Dawn reached this spot first, not because of geography alone, because some line had been made here against night. He whispered to Mira, the bells. She caught on at once. And the salt. He still had some in his pocket from the pantry, grains spilled loose by running. The tall one noticed the glance toward the pit. Its branch crown stirred. Do not touch what you do not keep. Then, for the first time, its voice changed. It became Ethan's. Come closer. He shut his ears to it as best he could and moved. The lesser creatures rushed in from the trees. The clearing exploded into motion. Ethan hurled the lantern at the nearest of them. Glass shattered. Flame blossomed over frost and dry grass in a sudden crawling arc. Two pale bodies recoiled with shrieks and spun back from the fire. Mira swung the poker hard at another, reaching for her shoulder. The blow landed with a cracking sound. The creature folded sideways and vanished into the grass like a dropped coat. Bells, Ethan shouted. They ran for the ruined platform. The tall one moved with shocking speed, not running but simply arriving where it needed to be. One moment it stood near the tree line. The next it was at the edge of the pit with the branch crown blotting out the stars. Ethan slid on frost and nearly fell. Mira slammed into the beam beside him and caught herself. The nearest bell hung from a nail-rusted wire. Ethan tore it free and rang it with all his strength. The clear, hard note split the clearing. Every lesser creature flinched at once. The tall one stopped, not hurt, interrupted. Mira understood immediately. She seized another bell and struck it against the beam again and again until the whole ridge rang with wild metallic clamoring. Ethan flung salt in a rough, shaking line across the broken platform boards around the pit anywhere he could. The grains glittered pale in the starlight and the firelight behind. The tall one spoke in a dozen voices at once now. Stop, please. You don't know enough. The last word came in its own voice, and the force of it dimmed the flames for a breath. Ethan rang the bell again. The sound traveled down through the boards and into the pit beneath them. Something answered from far below, not a voice but a deep, resonant knock from the dark under the ridge, as if the mountain itself had heard and shifted. The tall one recoiled one step. That one step told Ethan everything. The threshold still lived here. More, Mira cried. Together they rang every bell they could reach, some broken, some whole, until the clearing became a storm of harsh metallic notes. The lesser creatures writhed back toward the tree line, hands over faces, mouths opening sideways in voiceless cries. The fire from the shattered lantern licked through the frost-ringed grass in a wavering semicircle that held them for the moment. The tall one stood at the edge of the salt and bells and would not cross. Now, in the violence of all that ringing, Ethan saw its face for the first time. Not fully. Never fully. But within the shadow there flickered features like many faces layered together and wearing away. An old woman's cheekbone, a young man's eye, a child's brow, a hunter's beard, none held long enough to be recognized. It was not one being in the simple sense. It was an accumulation, memory standing upright, hunger with manners. The forest's long refusal to forget what had been promised to it. The sight nearly unmanned him. Then, somewhere beyond the eastern mountains, a line of color touched the horizon. Not sunlight yet, only the first cold paling of the world. The tall one turned toward it. When it looked back at Ethan and Mira, its voice had quieted again. Morning takes what night cannot keep, it said. It stepped backward toward the trees. The lesser creatures followed, though unwillingly, writhing at the bells and glancing toward the paling ridge with increasing panic. Ethan kept ringing until his arm ached. Mira kept ringing until the skin split across her knuckles. The tall one retreated to the tree line and stopped there with its branch crown among the pines. Dawn's first gray grew stronger behind Ethan's shoulder. Frost began to show true white on the stones. The faces of the lesser creatures grew thin and uncertain, as if less substance held them in this lesser dark. Then one of them broke rank and lunged. It came low through the grass straight for Mira. She saw it too late. Ethan moved without thinking and drove himself between them, bell in one hand, broken lantern handle in the other. The creature struck him hard enough to spin him sideways into the pit rail. The world flashed white. He felt cold race up his arm where its hand caught his wrist. Not pain exactly, but an emptiness spreading inward. Mira brought the poker down across its back with a sound like snapping ice. The creature released him and sprang away shrieking. Ethan's wrist had gone white where it touched him, veins standing dark beneath the skin like frost under glass. He could still move it, barely. "It's fine," he lied. Mira looked at the horizon. Gray had become silver. "Stay up," she said. "Whatever happens, stay up." They rang the bells into the coming light and waited for the night to lose its hold. Sleep deprivation. The driver kept glancing between them and the tree line above, as if he already knew the answer to any question he might ask and wanted no part of hearing it spoken aloud. He let them into the cab without argument. The heater smelled of dust and old coffee. Warm air struck Ethan's frozen wrist and made the handprint there blaze. Mira hissed softly when she saw the mark more clearly in daylight, but she said nothing in front of the driver. "You come from the old Halewick place?" the man asked after they had gone a mile. Neither Ethan nor Mira answered at first. That silence was answer enough. The driver's mouth flattened. "Thought so." "You know it?" Mira asked. "Know enough to keep clear of it after sunset." He kept his eyes on the road. "Couple folks still rent it out from time to time through agencies 2 owners removed." "Papers get lost, stories don't," Ethan swallowed. "Why doesn't someone burn it down?" The old man gave him a strange look. "Burned once already, didn't help." No one spoke after that. At the ranger station, the driver got them hot water, blankets, and a phone. Their calls took time. Too much time. No signal had reached the mountain house, but in daylight the simple machinery of the world returned: police reports, emergency clinic, questions that sounded absurd when answered plainly. They gave a trimmed version: strange animals, forced flight from a remote rental, possible trespassers, broken windows. They left out the voices. They left out the staircase in the wall and the face with Ethan's features climbing up from the earth. They left out the antlered thing at the ridge because no sentence in an office could hold it without sounding insane. At the clinic, the nurse cleaned Mira's cuts and examined Ethan's wrist. She called the handprint cold injury with unusual pattern and wrapped it after warming it slowly. He did not argue because arguing would have required a reality he could share. By noon, they sat in plastic chairs by a vending machine, wearing borrowed thermal blankets over borrowed clothes while officials made phone calls about the rental. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. A child somewhere down the hall cried because he wanted juice. An older television muttered weather reports to no one. The normality of it all should have calmed Ethan. Instead, it made the night feel more dangerous by contrast. If such horror could exist one ridge away from a vending machine and a weather bulletin, then the world was wider in the wrong direction than he had ever imagined. Mira slept first, head on his shoulder despite everything. Ethan stayed awake and watched the hallway. Sometime in the afternoon, a deputy returned from the property. He did not come close at once. He stood speaking quietly to another officer near the nurse's desk, glancing toward Ethan and Mira twice with an expression he failed to hide. At last he approached. "The house is there," he said. Ethan stared at him. The deputy shifted awkwardly. "Windows broken, some interior damage, old generator dead, no sign of animals inside, no tracks that made much sense." But he hesitated. "But what?" The man drew breath through his nose. "There's no shed." Mira woke at that, or perhaps she had not been fully asleep. "What?" "No outbuilding on the property, not now. Not in county photos going back 15 years, just the house." Ethan felt the clinic chair tilt under him, though of course it had not moved. "No," he said. "I started the generator." "The floodlights?" "We found poles for old lines, long dead. Nothing attached." The deputy looked embarrassed, which was almost worse than if he had looked skeptical. Embarrassment suggested that he believed they believed it, and did not know what kindness looked like in response. "What about the east clearing?" Mira asked quietly. He frowned. "There's a fire watch ruin on the ridge, yes. Old survey pit, some metal debris. We didn't go close. Ground's unstable. And bells," he paused. "Some old hardware. That was all." After he left, neither of them spoke for several minutes. Then Mira said very softly, "There was a shed." "Yes. We both saw it." "Yes. And if there was no shed, then what did you walk to?" He looked at the wrapped shape of his hand. He thought of the tall one saying, "This was a house before your house." Perhaps the mountain had more old rooms than maps could keep. Perhaps structures remembered themselves the way thresholds did. Perhaps once something is built often enough in fear, it remains available tonight long after daylight has forgotten where to place it. He said none of that. Instead he said, "Something that wanted us alive a little longer." Mira leaned back in the chair and shut her eyes. "I hate that answer." "So do I." They left the mountains before evening. A friend drove 4 hours to collect them because neither trusted themselves on the road. By then the sun was low again, and both Ethan and Mira had become unreasonably tense at every stand of trees, every long shadow on the highway shoulder, every glimpse of dark windows in passing houses. They said little during the drive. At one point, the friend asked gently whether they wanted the radio on. Mira answered too sharply. The radio stayed off. That first night back in the city, neither of them slept. They tried. They sat on a real couch under real electric light with every room in Mira's apartment open and visible. They checked the locks 3 times. They covered the long hallway mirror with a bedsheet without discussing why. At midnight, a neighbor dropped something heavy upstairs and both of them flinched hard enough to spill tea. At 2 in the morning, Ethan heard, unmistakably, 3 knocks and then 2 from the apartment door. He and Mira looked at each other. No one moved. After a long minute, Ethan went to the peephole. The hallway outside was empty under steady yellow bulbs. When he stepped back, Mira was holding the kitchen salt container in one hand as if she had never put it down since the cellar. The second knock never came. Days passed. Then weeks. In daylight, the experience frayed around the edges the way nightmares do. Work emails returned. Laundry had to be done. People asked casual questions about the failed mountain weekend and accepted polite lies in return. Yet some facts refused to loosen. Ethan's wrist kept the pale print long after frostbite should have healed. Mira woke at dawn every morning whether she wanted to or not. Neither of them could stand in front of an uncovered mirror at night. And whenever rain began after dark, both of them felt the same instant tightening in the chest, as if some older weather were on its way. They reported the rental listing, tracked down the agency, demanded removal. The listing disappeared. Whether the house did not exist in the records properly or existed too many times under too many names, they could never discover. The owner number went dead. Emails bounced. The road on the booking confirmation led to a county map pin that drifted depending on the service used. Sometimes it landed near the ridge, sometimes miles away. Once, on Ethan's screen only, it marked a place in the middle of a reservoir. By the start of winter, they had stopped searching, not because they were satisfied, because searching felt too much like answering a voice from the trees. Months later, on a morning of hard, clear frost, Ethan received an envelope with no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper, yellowed and folded with care. On it, in the same narrow hand as the journal, were 7 words: "Morning writes the distances." Night only borrows, nothing else. No signature, no explanation. Ethan stood in his kitchen for a long time holding the page while the city moved normally beyond the window. Traffic lights changed. A delivery bike rattled past. Somewhere below, someone laughed into a phone. In the reflection on the glass, he could see his own face, older now by something that had nothing to do with years. For one bad second, he imagined another face rising over his shoulder in the reflection, long and pale and smiling too wide. Skin stretched tight across a skull that seemed to shift under it, eyes like drowned coins fixed on him with patient delight. He did not turn. He reached calmly for the salt bowl kept by the window, set it beneath the envelope, and waited for the fear to pass. Outside, the winter sun climbed higher. Inside, the room remained his. Yet even then, in full day, he could not quite shake the sense that the woods had not lost them so much as set them back down for a while, changed, marked, and carrying a threshold within themselves now, a private border they would spend the rest of their lives defending each night until morning.